Your soulmate shared their real feelings about you in secret. Before you allow another thought to pull your attention somewhere else, stay with this story for just a little while, because what you are about to hear is not a promise about the future but a quiet tale about two hearts that never truly stopped carrying pieces of one another. Somewhere, on an ordinary evening that looked completely unremarkable from the outside, a conversation began without anyone realizing how deeply it would matter. It was not planned. It was not dramatic. No one stood up to make a speech. No music played in the background. There were only a few people talking about life, memories, and the strange way certain people leave a lasting mark on our hearts. Then, without warning, someone mentioned your name. The room became quieter than before, not because anyone asked for silence, but because the person everyone had been listening to suddenly stopped pretending that their feelings were simple. For a long time they had convinced themselves that hiding the truth was easier than speaking it aloud. They believed that if they kept smiling, changed the subject, and acted as though everything had moved on, eventually those feelings would disappear on their own. But hearts rarely follow the rules that fear creates. Sometimes the more we hide something, the more clearly it waits beneath the surface. That evening, every wall they had carefully built around their emotions began to crack. At first they laughed softly, trying to avoid the question, yet the smile on their face carried a sadness that someone sitting across from them immediately noticed. They gently asked, "If you could tell them one thing without worrying about the outcome, what would you say?" No one expected an answer. Everyone assumed the conversation would drift somewhere else. Instead, after a long silence, they looked toward the window, took a slow breath, and admitted something they had never shared before. They said they still remembered the smallest details that everyone else had forgotten. They remembered the kindness that never asked for attention, the quiet patience that appeared during difficult moments, the way a simple conversation could make an ordinary day feel meaningful. They confessed that no matter how many times they tried to convince themselves to stop thinking about you, memories always found their way back. They admitted that what they missed most was not excitement or mystery but the feeling of peace they experienced whenever your presence became part of their day. Those listening realized these were not rehearsed words. They were emotions that had been locked away for far too long. One friend quietly asked why none of this had ever been said before. Another wondered what had created so much hesitation. The answer came slowly. Fear. Fear of arriving too late. Fear of saying the wrong thing. Fear that honesty might change everything forever. Yet beneath every fear was something much stronger, a quiet hope that maybe, somewhere, life had not completely closed the door on what once felt possible. As the conversation continued, they spoke about the moments they wished they could relive, not to rewrite history, but simply to appreciate them more deeply. They admitted there were countless times they almost reached out, almost sent a message, almost spoke the truth, only to stop themselves at the last second. They wondered whether silence had protected them or merely kept them trapped inside unanswered questions. One person smiled gently and said that some feelings refused to disappear because they were never meant to be ignored in the first place. Those words stayed in the room long after they were spoken. For the first time, the person carrying these hidden emotions stopped defending their silence. They simply accepted that what they felt was real, whether anyone else understood it or not. They realized that pretending had become far more exhausting than honesty. They admitted they still hoped that if life ever created another chance, they would no longer waste it hiding behind uncertainty. They wanted to become someone brave enough to speak before another season passed in silence. The people around them listened without interruption because they could tell this confession had taken years to find its voice. No one judged them. No one laughed. Instead, they reminded them that sincerity is never something to be ashamed of. Sometimes the greatest mistake is not loving someone deeply but believing those feelings must remain hidden forever. As the evening drew closer to its end, they quietly whispered one final thought that no one in the room expected. They said that if they ever met you again, they would not begin by talking about regret or missed opportunities. They would begin with gratitude. Gratitude for every memory, every lesson, every quiet moment that continued shaping the person they had become. They believed that some people enter our lives not simply to create beautiful memories but to quietly change the way we understand ourselves. Whether paths crossed again or remained separate, they would always be thankful that your story had become part of theirs. Those words settled over everyone like the calm that follows a long storm. No one rushed to fill the silence because everyone understood they had just witnessed something rare, a heart choosing honesty after carrying its truth alone for far too long. And although you were never in that room, your name remained there long after the conversation ended, not as a memory fading into the distance, but as a reminder that genuine feelings, once finally spoken, have a remarkable way of continuing to echo long after the voices themselves have fallen silent. The conversation ended, but the silence it left behind refused to disappear. Long after everyone had gone home, the words that had finally escaped their heart continued to echo in their mind. It was as though speaking honestly had unlocked a part of themselves they had hidden for far too long. They walked through the quiet streets that night replaying every sentence they had spoken, wondering if they had revealed too much or if, perhaps, they had only scratched the surface of everything they truly wished you could know. The evening air felt unusually calm, yet inside their heart emotions continued to rise and fall like gentle waves against the shore. They realized that for years they had mistaken silence for strength, believing that hiding their feelings would somehow make them disappear. Instead, those emotions had quietly grown stronger with every passing season, waiting patiently for the moment they could finally breathe. As they looked toward the night sky, memories returned one after another, not in perfect order but as scattered moments that somehow fit together like pieces of an unfinished story. They remembered the first time your kindness caught them by surprise. It was never about grand gestures or dramatic moments. It was the smallest things that stayed with them. The way you listened without interrupting. The way your smile seemed genuine even on difficult days. The way your words carried warmth without asking for anything in return. Those ordinary moments slowly became extraordinary in their memory because they represented something they had struggled to find anywhere else, a feeling of peace. They admitted to themselves that they had spent too much time searching for excitement while overlooking the quiet comfort that had always mattered more. One of the friends from that evening sent them a short message before going to sleep. It simply read, "I'm glad you finally told the truth." They stared at those words for several minutes before placing the phone down. It was strange how a simple sentence could feel so powerful. For the first time in years, they no longer felt trapped behind their own unspoken thoughts. There was still uncertainty about what tomorrow might bring, but there was also a quiet sense of relief. The truth no longer belonged only to their heart. Someone else had heard it. Someone else understood it. That alone made the burden feel lighter. As the days passed, they noticed something changing inside themselves. They smiled more often, not because every problem had disappeared, but because pretending had finally come to an end. They began paying attention to little reminders that brought your memory back in gentle ways. A familiar song playing unexpectedly in a cafe. A place that reminded them of an old conversation. A sunset whose colors looked strangely familiar. None of these moments felt painful anymore. Instead, they became quiet reminders of how deeply one person can shape another without ever realizing it. Their friends noticed the difference too. The hesitation that once filled every conversation had started to fade. They no longer avoided mentioning your name. They no longer changed the subject whenever someone asked about the past. Instead, they spoke with honesty, accepting that caring about someone was never something to be embarrassed by. During another gathering a few days later, someone asked them a question that seemed simple at first. If you could say anything to them today, without fear and without expecting anything in return, what would it be? This time there was no long silence. There was no nervous laugh. They answered almost immediately. They said they would thank you. Not because life had been perfect, but because meeting you had quietly changed the way they understood love, patience, and sincerity. They would tell you that some people leave behind memories, while others leave behind lessons that continue shaping the heart long after the moment has passed. They admitted they had become a better person because of everything they had experienced. Even the misunderstandings had taught them compassion. Even the distance had taught them appreciation. One friend smiled softly and said, "Sometimes the greatest feelings are the ones that make us grow, even when they ask us to wait." Those words settled deeply within them. They realized they could no longer keep measuring life by what had been lost. Instead, they wanted to focus on the person they were becoming. They began writing down thoughts they had never shared with anyone. Small reflections about courage, gratitude, forgiveness, hope. They never planned to show those pages to anyone, yet writing them helped organize emotions that had once felt impossible to explain. Every page carried traces of your influence, not because everything was about you, but because your presence had quietly encouraged them to become more honest with themselves. Weeks continued to pass, yet one feeling remained unchanged. Whenever someone asked them what genuine affection looked like, they never described dramatic promises or impossible fantasies. They described trust. They described respect. They described peaceful conversations that made ordinary days feel brighter. They described someone whose presence made silence feel comfortable instead of awkward. They realized that what they valued most had never been perfection. It had always been authenticity. Looking back, they wished they had understood that sooner. They wished fear had not stolen so many opportunities to speak openly. Yet they refused to remain trapped by regret. Every sunrise reminded them that life continues offering chances to become braver than yesterday. Every evening reminded them that honesty, even when delayed, is still worthwhile. One afternoon, while sitting alone with a warm cup of coffee, they quietly whispered something that no one else heard. They hoped that wherever you were, life was treating you gently. They hoped you had found reasons to smile. They hoped you never doubted your own worth simply because someone else had once struggled to express what they truly felt. That quiet wish carried no expectation of being heard. It simply came from a heart that had finally learned the value of speaking sincerely, even when no audience was present. And in that moment they understood something that changed everything. Genuine feelings are not measured by how loudly they are spoken but by how faithfully they continue living inside the heart through changing seasons, uncertain days, and unexpected turns. They accepted that whatever the future held, they would never again hide from the truth of what they had felt. Their story was no longer defined by silence. It was defined by the courage to finally let honesty become stronger than fear, and that single decision became the beginning of a completely different chapter, one that neither they nor anyone who had listened to their quiet confession would ever forget. A new chapter rarely announces itself with dramatic music or impossible coincidences. More often, it begins with an ordinary morning that feels almost identical to every other morning until one quiet realization changes the way a person looks at the world. That was exactly what happened next. They woke before the sunrise, not because an alarm had interrupted their sleep, but because their mind refused to settle. The conversation from that evening still echoed through every corner of their heart. For the first time in years, they did not feel the urge to run from their emotions. Instead, they allowed themselves to sit with them, to understand them, and to accept that some truths become lighter only after they are spoken aloud. They made a cup of coffee and stood beside the window watching the first light slowly erase the darkness from the sky. As the city quietly came to life, they found themselves thinking about you again, not with sadness, but with a strange feeling of gratitude. It surprised them. For so long they had believed that remembering you would always bring pain, yet now those memories carried warmth instead of regret. They realized that the heart changes when it stops fighting against what it has always known. Later that afternoon they met one of the same friends who had witnessed the confession. The conversation was simple at first. They talked about work, ordinary responsibilities, and the little routines that fill everyday life. But eventually the subject returned to you. Their friend smiled gently and asked, "After everything you said that night, do you feel different?" They paused for a long moment before answering. Then they nodded. "Yes," they said quietly. "Not because anything outside has changed, but because something inside finally has." Their friend listened carefully as they continued. They admitted that for years they had confused silence with maturity. They believed that keeping feelings hidden was the responsible choice. They thought pretending to move on would somehow make the heart obey. Instead, every unspoken word had quietly followed them into every season of life. They carried those emotions into celebrations, into lonely evenings, into moments of success, and even into moments of failure. No matter where they went, a small part of their heart kept wondering how different everything might have been if they had simply been honest sooner. Their friend leaned back and said something that stayed with them for the rest of the day. "The heart doesn't punish us for loving. It only grows heavy when we stop telling the truth." Those words settled deeply within them. They walked home thinking about every opportunity fear had quietly stolen. They remembered messages they had typed but never sent. Conversations they had imagined but never started. Simple questions they wanted to ask but convinced themselves to keep inside. Looking back, none of those moments seemed impossible anymore. They only seemed unfinished. That evening they opened an old notebook they had not touched in years. Between its pages were scattered thoughts, unfinished sentences, and little reminders written during different seasons of life. Some pages contained hopes. Others contained doubts. A few simply held names and dates that meant something only to them. As they turned each page, they realized one thing remained constant through every chapter. No matter how much life changed, your presence had quietly remained somewhere between the lines. Not because every thought was about you, but because meeting you had changed the way they understood kindness, patience, and connection. They picked up a pen and began writing again. This time there was no hesitation. They wrote about the lessons they had learned. They admitted how often fear disguises itself as logic. They wrote that waiting for the perfect moment usually means watching countless beautiful moments disappear. They promised themselves that if life ever placed another meaningful conversation in front of them, they would no longer allow uncertainty to decide their future. They would choose honesty, even if honesty felt frightening. Days slowly became weeks. Something unexpected happened during that time. The people closest to them noticed they had become calmer. They laughed more naturally. They listened more carefully. They no longer seemed distracted by thoughts they refused to share. One family member even commented that they looked lighter, as though they had finally set down a burden they had been carrying for far too long. They smiled quietly because that description felt exactly right. The weight had not disappeared because the past had changed. It disappeared because they had stopped carrying it alone. One rainy evening they found themselves walking through a familiar neighborhood where memories seemed to appear around every corner. The cafe where long conversations once stretched into the evening. The quiet street where ordinary walks somehow became unforgettable. The small bookstore that still carried the same comforting smell of paper and coffee. None of these places had changed very much, yet they felt different because they were seeing them through different eyes. Instead of wishing they could relive every moment, they simply appreciated that those moments had existed at all. Gratitude slowly replaced regret. Acceptance quietly replaced fear. As they continued walking, they realized something that made them stop for a moment. Love is not always measured by grand declarations or dramatic endings. Sometimes it reveals itself through the quiet hope that another person is happy, even when you are not there to witness it. They whispered those words to themselves as though repeating an important lesson they never wanted to forget. Later that night another friend called unexpectedly. After a long conversation, they asked a question no one else had dared to ask. "Do you think you'll ever stop caring?" They smiled softly before answering. "I don't think real feelings disappear because we decide they should. I think they change. They become quieter. They become wiser. They stop asking for impossible things and start wishing only for truth, peace, and happiness." The friend remained silent for a moment before saying, "That might be the most honest thing you've ever said." Those words lingered long after the call ended. Before going to sleep they stood once more beside the same window where this new chapter had quietly begun. The stars looked brighter than usual, or perhaps their heart had simply become more willing to notice beauty again. They closed their eyes and made one silent promise to themselves. No matter what tomorrow brought, they would never again allow fear to become louder than sincerity. Whether life reunited old paths or opened completely new ones, they wanted to face the future with an honest heart instead of a guarded one. They finally understood that the greatest transformation had never been about changing someone else's mind. It had always been about finding the courage to stop hiding from their own. And without realizing it, that quiet promise became the beginning of another story, one that would soon place them in front of a decision they never expected, a decision that would test everything they had learned about patience, truth, and the remarkable power of finally choosing honesty over silence. The promise they made to themselves stayed with them long after that quiet evening had passed. It was no longer just another hopeful thought whispered into the silence. It became something they carried into every ordinary day, every conversation, and every quiet moment when the past tried to return. They discovered that genuine change rarely arrives all at once. Instead, it appears in small decisions that seem almost invisible at first. Choosing honesty instead of pretending. Choosing gratitude instead of regret. Choosing to remember without allowing memories to become chains. Weeks passed, and life continued with its familiar rhythm, yet something inside them had become unmistakably different. Friends noticed they smiled without forcing it. Family members commented that their eyes seemed calmer than before. Even strangers found them easier to talk to because they no longer carried the invisible weight that had once surrounded every word they spoke. They were finally learning what peace felt like, and that peace did not come from forgetting you. It came from accepting everything they had been too afraid to admit. One afternoon, while organizing old papers and forgotten photographs, they found a small note tucked between the pages of a book they had not opened in years. It wasn't anything extraordinary. Just a few simple words written during a happier season of life. Yet reading them felt like opening a door that had quietly waited all this time. They smiled, not because the note promised anything about the future, but because it reminded them that some of the most meaningful moments had always been the simplest ones. They realized that people often spend years searching for dramatic signs while overlooking the quiet memories that continue shaping the heart every single day. That evening they met the same close friend who had first encouraged them to tell the truth. The conversation flowed naturally until their friend asked a question that seemed simple but carried surprising depth. If life gave you one more chance to speak without fear, would you say anything differently now? They remained silent for several moments, thinking carefully before answering. No, they finally replied. I would simply say it sooner. Their friend smiled because they understood exactly what those words meant. Growth had not erased the past. It had only changed the way they looked at it. They no longer wished to rewrite old chapters. They only wished they had entered them with greater courage. As the days continued, they became more aware of how often your name quietly appeared in unexpected places. A familiar song playing in a cafe. A favorite book resting on a shelf. A phrase someone casually spoke during an ordinary conversation. None of these moments felt like coincidences demanding interpretation. Instead, They were gentle reminders that meaningful connections leave lasting impressions. They no longer tried to push those memories away. They welcomed them with quiet appreciation, allowing them to exist without turning them into unanswered questions. One rainy afternoon they found themselves sitting alone near a window watching people hurry through the streets below. Everyone seemed focused on reaching somewhere else. Everyone appeared busy chasing the next responsibility, the next appointment, the next destination. Watching them, they suddenly understood how often people rush through life believing they will always have another opportunity to say what truly matters. Yet tomorrow is never guaranteed in the way we imagine. That realization strengthened the promise they had made weeks earlier. If another meaningful conversation ever appeared before them, they would never again allow fear to speak louder than honesty. Later that night their phone rang unexpectedly. It was another longtime friend who had heard about the quiet confession from weeks before. After talking for a while, the friend gently asked, "Do you still think about them?" They smiled before answering because there was no longer any reason to hide the truth. "Yes," they admitted. "Not every moment. Not every day. But often enough to remind me how much one person can influence another simply by being genuine." There was no sadness in those words. Only gratitude. Only acceptance. Their friend responded with something they would remember for a long time. Maybe the people who change us the most are never meant to disappear completely from our hearts. Maybe they're meant to remind us who we become when we're brave enough to love honestly. Those words echoed through their thoughts long after the conversation ended. They walked outside beneath a sky filled with quiet stars and realized they no longer feared the future the way they once had. Whether life brought unexpected reunions or entirely new beginnings, they wanted to face both with the same open heart they had spent so many years trying to protect. They had finally learned that protecting the heart by hiding it only creates loneliness. Protecting it with honesty creates peace. Standing beneath the quiet night sky, they whispered one final thought that no one else could hear. They hoped that wherever life had taken you, you had found reasons to laugh without hesitation, dreams worth chasing, and people who recognized the kindness they had always admired. They hoped your days were filled with moments that reminded you of your own strength. Most of all, they hoped you never doubted that your presence had quietly changed another life in ways words could never fully explain. As they turned to walk home, they felt something they had not experienced in a very long time. It was not certainty about what tomorrow would bring. It was something even more valuable. It was trust. Trust that whatever chapter waited ahead would no longer be written by fear. It would be written by truth, patience, gratitude, and the quiet courage to never again leave important feelings locked behind silence. Without realizing it, that single decision was already guiding them toward a meeting they never expected, a moment where the distance between memory and reality would become far smaller than either of them had ever imagined. The following morning arrived with the same quiet sunlight that had greeted countless ordinary days before it, yet something about this one felt different. It was not because the world had suddenly changed, nor because an extraordinary event had interrupted the familiar rhythm of life. The difference existed entirely within them. For the first time in years, they stepped into the day without carrying the exhausting weight of unfinished emotions. Every breath felt lighter. Every decision seemed clearer. They had finally accepted that the truth they spoke that evening had not weakened them. It had quietly become the strongest part of who they were. As they walked through familiar streets, they noticed details they had ignored for far too long. Children laughing without worrying about tomorrow. Elderly couples sitting peacefully on benches, speaking very little because years had already taught them that the deepest understanding rarely requires endless words. People rushing toward work with determined expressions, each carrying invisible stories no stranger could possibly understand. Watching all of it unfold reminded them that every person quietly carries chapters no one else ever reads. Their own hidden chapter had remained unfinished for years, but now those pages were finally beginning to find their ending. Later that afternoon they received an unexpected invitation from a close friend to join a small gathering. At first they almost declined out of habit, but something inside encouraged them to go. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was the quiet promise they had made to stop allowing fear to make ordinary decisions. When they arrived, the atmosphere felt relaxed. Conversations flowed naturally. Laughter filled the room. For a while they simply listened, enjoying the rare comfort of being completely present instead of trapped inside memories. Then someone unexpectedly asked a simple question that caused the room to grow thoughtful. What is the biggest lesson life has taught you so far? One person spoke about forgiveness. Another spoke about patience. Someone else described resilience after difficult years. Eventually every eye turned toward them. They smiled gently before answering. The greatest lesson I've learned is that silence often protects fear more than it protects the heart. The room became quiet. They continued speaking without hesitation. For years I believed that hiding my feelings was the safest choice. I convinced myself that saying nothing would prevent disappointment. But all silence really did was delay honesty. Looking back, I don't regret caring deeply. I only regret believing that genuine feelings should remain unspoken. No one interrupted. Every person listened with complete attention because the sincerity in those words required no explanation. One of the older guests nodded slowly and replied, "Life becomes much lighter the day we stop hiding from ourselves." Those words stayed with them long after the gathering ended. Walking home beneath the evening sky, they realized how many people spend years searching for answers outside themselves while quietly avoiding the truth already waiting inside their own hearts. They no longer wanted to live that way. They wanted every meaningful relationship in their life to be built upon honesty rather than assumptions, courage rather than hesitation, presence rather than fear. As the weeks continued, another unexpected change appeared. The memories that once returned with sadness now arrived carrying gratitude instead. Instead of asking themselves what could have been different, they found themselves appreciating everything that had quietly shaped them into the person they were becoming. Every conversation, every misunderstanding, every joyful moment, every difficult goodbye had contributed something valuable. Even unanswered questions had taught them patience. Even moments of distance had taught them the importance of presence. One quiet evening they visited a peaceful park where they often went whenever they needed time to think. The trees swayed gently in the evening breeze. Birds settled into their nests as the golden light slowly faded beyond the horizon. Sitting alone on a familiar bench, they closed their eyes and allowed complete silence to surround them. In that silence they realized something they had never fully understood before. Loving someone had never been the difficult part. The difficult part had always been believing they were worthy of expressing that love honestly. Somewhere along the way fear had convinced them that vulnerability was weakness, when in reality vulnerability had always been another name for courage. They smiled softly as that realization settled into their heart. For years they had searched for confidence in achievements, recognition, and certainty about the future. Yet true confidence had quietly been waiting inside one simple decision: the willingness to speak sincerely without controlling the outcome. From that day forward they promised themselves something new. If appreciation entered their heart, they would express it. If gratitude appeared, they would share it. If someone mattered deeply, they would never assume there would always be another opportunity to tell them. Time moves too quietly for promises like someday. The future belongs only to those willing to honor today. As darkness gently covered the evening sky, they stood from the bench and began walking home once again. Their pace was slow, not because they were tired, but because they no longer felt the need to rush through life. Every step carried quiet purpose. Every breath reminded them that peace does not arrive when every question receives an answer. Peace arrives when the heart finally stops arguing with its own truth. And although they could not possibly know what tomorrow would bring, they sensed that life was gradually leading them toward one final conversation, a meeting where words left unsaid for far too many years would finally find the courage to become spoken aloud. The days that followed carried an unusual sense of calm. Nothing extraordinary happened on the surface, yet everything inside them continued to change. They no longer measured life by unanswered questions or by the distance between what had been imagined and what had become reality. Instead, they focused on becoming the kind of person who would never again allow fear to silence honesty. Then, one quiet afternoon, life offered something they had never expected. It was not a dramatic reunion or an impossible coincidence. It was simply an ordinary moment that arrived with extraordinary meaning. They found themselves standing in a familiar place, one they had not visited for a long time. The air felt peaceful, and the sounds around them faded into the background as they noticed someone walking toward them. For a brief second, time seemed to slow. Countless memories flashed through their mind, not as regrets, but as gentle reminders of how far they had come. Their heart did not race because of fear anymore. It beat with quiet gratitude. They realized that regardless of what happened next, they no longer needed to hide who they were. As the distance between them grew smaller, they smiled naturally, without rehearsing what they wanted to say. They had imagined this moment so many times in the past that they once believed it would require perfect words. Now they understood something much more important. Genuine moments are never created by perfect speeches. They are created by sincere hearts. After exchanging a simple greeting, there was a brief silence, but this silence felt completely different from the silence that had separated them before. It was comfortable, honest, peaceful. Finally, they spoke. They admitted that life had taught them many lessons since they had last shared meaningful conversations. They confessed that for a long time they believed pretending was easier than honesty, but eventually discovered that the heart always carries unfinished truths until they are finally acknowledged. They thanked you, not because every chapter had been easy, but because every chapter had helped them become wiser, kinder, and more grateful. They admitted that your presence had quietly shaped their understanding of patience, compassion, and courage in ways they never fully appreciated until much later. They did not ask for promises. They did not demand explanations. They simply expressed appreciation without expecting anything in return. Listening carefully, you smiled softly. There was no anger in your expression. No bitterness. Only understanding. You explained that life had also changed you. Time had offered new perspectives, new experiences, and new lessons. You admitted that everyone carries moments they wish they had handled differently, yet those moments often become the very experiences that teach the greatest wisdom. Neither of you tried to rewrite the past because both of you understood that every difficult chapter had quietly prepared you for this conversation. The discussion continued naturally, touching on dreams, personal growth, family, hopes for the future, and the importance of never allowing fear to replace honesty again. Hours seemed to pass without either of you noticing. There were moments of laughter as forgotten memories returned, moments of quiet reflection as meaningful experiences were shared, and moments of peaceful silence where neither person felt the need to fill every second with words. It became clear that genuine connection had never depended on dramatic gestures. It had always depended on authenticity. Before it was time to leave, they looked at you one final time and said something they had carried in their heart for far too long. No matter where life takes us from here, thank you for being part of my story. Thank you for helping me become someone who finally understands that honesty is never something to postpone. Thank you for reminding me that kindness leaves an impact long after moments have passed. Whatever tomorrow brings, I will always be grateful that our paths crossed. Those words were not spoken with sadness. They were spoken with peace. As both of you prepared to go your separate ways, there was no feeling of unfinished business anymore. Whether life continued your journey together or led you toward different horizons was no longer the most important question. The most important thing had already happened. Truth had finally replaced silence. Gratitude had replaced regret. Courage had replaced fear. Walking away, they noticed something remarkable. Their heart felt lighter than it ever had before. Not because every dream had come true exactly as imagined, but because they had finally become completely honest with themselves. They realized that the greatest victory in life is not convincing someone else to understand your heart. The greatest victory is finding the courage to understand it yourself. From that day forward, they carried one lesson into every relationship and every new beginning. Never assume tomorrow will offer another chance to express appreciation. Never believe sincerity should wait for a perfect moment. Never allow fear to decide what love, friendship, or gratitude deserves to hear. Life moves quietly, and the most meaningful words are often the simplest ones spoken at the right time. As another sunset painted the sky with gentle shades of gold and orange, they paused for one last look at the horizon. Instead of wondering what might have been, they smiled at everything that had been. Every joy, every misunderstanding, every goodbye, every lesson had become part of a beautiful journey toward inner peace. They understood that genuine feelings are never wasted. They shape character. They strengthen compassion. They teach patience. Most importantly, they remind us that the heart grows strongest when it chooses truth over fear. And so the story reached its quiet ending, not with impossible promises or dramatic declarations, but with something far more enduring: two people who had learned that honesty is always worth choosing, gratitude is always worth expressing, and the memories created through genuine kindness never truly fade. Some stories end with uncertainty, while others end with perfect certainty. This one ended with peace, because peace is the greatest gift a truthful heart can ever receive. And with that quiet understanding, both of them stepped forward into the next chapter of life, carrying no burden of unspoken words, only gratitude for the journey that had transformed them into stronger, wiser, and more compassionate people than they had ever imagined possible. The story was complete, but the lesson remained: cherish the people who bring light into your life, speak with sincerity while the opportunity exists, forgive what cannot be changed, appreciate what has been shared, and let every tomorrow begin with a heart that is unafraid to tell the truth.